Israel decided to commit a Nakba in Lebanon, displaced 1.2 million people, many of them internally in the country, but also thousands outside of Lebanon. A lot of people have been displaced into Syria. Over 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon. Israel issued over 77 evacuation orders for Lebanon, including for two Palestinian refugee camps filled with Palestinians who are refugees from the 1948 Nakba. So just a testament to how when you're a Palestinian, Nakba follows you wherever you are. There was that one Zionist influencer who did this whole tutorial about how to fake being injured from an Israeli airstrike.
Hopefully they get to put on a real tutorial pretty soon. Get ready with me in my bunker. It's called the Metula Special, actually.
Hello and welcome to episode 131 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for decolonization, justice, and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram. And you can call me Mikey Intifada if you invaded Lebanon in a tank and left in a helicopter.
Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram @ThePalestinePod. Find us also on Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes and additional podcasts per week. And we're also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with our Patreon subscribers only. So check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. Since we last spoke, Israel decided to commit a Nakba in Lebanon. And in a matter of a couple of weeks, has displaced 1.2 million people, many of them internally in the country, but also thousands outside of Lebanon. A lot of people have been displaced into Syria, including Syrian refugees themselves who had sought refuge in Lebanon. By now, over 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon. Israel issued over 77 evacuation orders for Lebanon, including for two Palestinian refugee camps filled with Palestinians who are refugees from the 1948 Nakba. So just a testament to how when you're a Palestinian, Nakba follows you wherever you are, and there is no expiration date on Nakba. People that were first displaced by Israel 76 years ago are now finding themselves displaced by Israel again, which again mirrors very much what we already saw in Gaza, because we know that Gaza itself is a collection of refugee camps of Palestinians, primarily from the 1948 Nakba. In parallel, Israel continues to bombard Gaza. Actually, today, the images out of the northern part of Gaza are horrifying. There's heavy shelling bombardment in the northern part of Gaza, which is not receiving very much attention because of the attention on Lebanon, because it is newer in the news cycle. Weird things are happening, like a vice presidential candidate is standing up before the American public talking about how the expansion of Israel is necessary for American interests.
And its proxies. And who are its proxies? ISIS. This dude literally stood on the stage and went from, we got to stop the war on terror, we got to stop these guys, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, whatever. We got to stop those guys. Even though the United States armed them, because it goes back to the Mujahideen and the CIA, Zbigniew Brzezinski, all of that, Osama bin Laden. Anyways, I'm just yelling out names. This is why I give off whistleblower energy. Anyways, but now they're like, instead of we have to squash this terror cell in West Asia, now they are like, actually, we have to support the expansion of the occupation of Palestine and its proxies, which is ISIS. And we know that because Benjamin Netanyahu, Milikowski, also provided medical aid. There was a picture that is famous from when he was standing over the bed of a Syrian CIA-backed ISIS fighter, providing him emotional support as he's getting medical aid.
Expansion. You're not allowed to expand your borders on top of the borders of other sovereign states. That's not how this works. We were told a lie that the post World War II world order had ushered in an era of universal human rights treaties, international law for the purpose of good, not international law for the purpose of colonial expansion, which was how it was conceived, the benefit of the slave trade and for the benefit of imperial resource theft and the subjugation and domination of natives, right? We all know how international law began. But we were sold this lie that no, things had changed. We witnessed a horrible Holocaust. And so now we have put into place safeguards. The world community has gotten together. We've signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've signed all of these other treaties on the elimination of racial discrimination, against apartheid, so on and so forth. The reality is that the world actually didn't change. And so while on the surface, you may occasionally have this language of human rights operating, the reality is that a vice presidential candidate can still stand up in front of the largest audience in the world
I don't know. There's probably Twitch streamers that have more viewers.
and argue for the expansion of Israel. That is deeply troubling. That flies in the face of all of the international norms that were allegedly put into place, protecting the sovereignty of states, against aggression, against the acquisition of territory by force. And he just said it so casually, as if this whole thing doesn't exist. And in reality, it doesn't exist. They tell you that it does exist so that you believe you live in this world where people care about these things, but it's not actually the case.
They tried to sell us the lie that the United States crushed Nazism and that Nazis no longer exist, right? That's what they told you. They told you Nazis no longer exist. But what they didn't tell you is that they actually do still exist. Surprise! They migrated to Argentina. They migrated to Palestine. They migrated to Russia and the United States. They were ingratiated in the intelligence apparatus, Operation Paperclip. And the Nazis are still around, but there's been a successful media PR campaign that has convinced people that there's no such thing as Nazis anymore. And those people, like, they're watching people carry tiki torches and they're like, no, but not those people. You know what I mean? And then they're watching the United States government literally state sanctioned lynch a prisoner who is innocent. And they're like, no, that's not fascism. You know what I mean? And then they're watching as a genocide unfolds for over a year now. And there is blind support coming from both sides. And they're like, no, 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 no. That is not fascism. And so at what point do we get to say, like, hey, it is fascism and you're a fascist and you've enabled all of this?
I didn't think that this genocide would still be ongoing a year later. But not only is it ongoing, it's expanding. And now we're seeing the mainstream media utilize the same techniques for Lebanon as they did to justify the annihilation of the Palestinian people in Gaza. So the framing is that it's a war against Hezbollah in the same way that the Palestinian genocide was a war against Hamas. They're publishing the same AI generated Zionist military propaganda showing you literally invented cartoon images of missiles and houses. And they're saying that's the justification for dropping bombs on families while they're sleeping. They're very likely relying on the same. Israel is very likely relying on the same AI technology that they used in Gaza to carry out mass killing quickly. Lavender, Where's Daddy, and the gospel, things which we learned over the last year. We learned of their existence and we learned of how they operate to automate Israel's killing machine. The Zionists are engaging in the same type of genocidal intent towards Lebanon that they displayed towards the Palestinian people in Gaza, but elsewhere. So they are openly calling for genocide in Lebanon. Some of them are calling for a takeover, the establishing of a buffer zone. Others are querying whether Lebanon is a quote state. And we've all seen the real estate ads made by the Israeli settler groups circulating on social media showing planned development of Israeli settlements in Lebanon by a company called the Lebanon Development Company, which, we saw the same thing happen in Gaza. Remember when they held their settlement conference attended by dozens of ministers and they unfurled huge maps showing how they were going to replace all of the Gazan cities with brand new settlements of different names. So they're going to turn my family's neighborhood of Zaytun to a settlement called Shivat Zion, right? They're doing the same thing now in Lebanon, the same provocative sort of psychological warfare by issuing these ads.
They learned that they can't name it the Jewish Colonial Association anymore.
Right. And in terms of action, right, genocidal acts, they're using the same 2,000-pound bombs, right? In the airstrike that killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, they flattened 6 residential apartment buildings filled with families. And again, nothing new here because we know that targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is part of the Israeli occupation forces DNA. When they invaded Lebanon in 2006, they developed the Dahia Doctrine, which was primarily the result of them carrying out mass destruction in the Dahia neighborhood of Lebanon. And they said, oh, okay, that's a great technique. We're going to use that now. And we're going to name it after this neighborhood where we carried out this wholesale destruction. It's a military technique. It flies in the face of all international norms. But for them, it's their MO. It's how they operate, right? So we're seeing so many of these same patterns. And of course, at the heart of it is the forced displacement. That's always at the heart of any Nakba, right? The mass forced displacement, the expulsion of people from their homes, and not knowing if people are going to be able to go back to their homes. Are they going to destroy everything and make it impossible for people to return, at least in the near future? And the forced displacement has been massive. 1.2 million people is a massive, massive, massive number.
Quick history of Lebanon and Hezbollah. So in 1978, the occupation of Palestine invaded Lebanon, and again in 1982, and occupied Lebanon until they were physically kicked out in 2000. And so I found a newspaper clipping from 1974 in a Lebanese daily, As Safir. Quote, Israel threatens daily airstrikes. That's the end of the quote. This was at a time when there was no Hezbollah and Iran was run by the Shah. This is according to a tweet from Assad Abu Khalil. So Hezbollah was born in 1982. And if you're not good with math, Zionist terrorism had been reigning for at least 4 years before Lebanese people developed an indigenous self-defense movement. In 1992, the occupation assassinated the former head of Hezbollah, Abbas al-Musawi, when they carpet bombed Lebanon, similarly to how they're doing right now. This gave rise to the reign of Nasrallah, a beloved figure all over the world. His speeches were the most consistently watched of any political figure in the region. His influence cannot be understated, and he was known for being charismatic, practical, and a fierce enemy to the Zionist regime. I once saw Lebanese comedian Natalie Ocker in Paris, and in her stand-up, she talked about how Lebanese people and Arabs all over the world would stop whatever they're doing to listen to his speeches, and how that was hard to explain to her German boyfriend and his family. Nasrallah deeply impacted culture. Edward Said said of Hassan Nasrallah after meeting with him in 2000, quote, I was in Lebanon for a summer visit. I gave 2 lectures and stayed with family and friends. Then I had a meeting with Hezbollah's spiritual leader, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, whom I found to be a remarkably impressive man. A very simple man, quite young, absolutely no bullshit. a man who adopted a strategy towards Israel quite similar to that of the Vietnamese against the Americans. We cannot fight them because they have an army, a navy, and a nuclear option. So the only way we can do it is to make them feel it in body bags. And that's exactly what he did. In the one conversation that we had, I was impressed by the fact that among all of the political leaders I met in the Middle East, he alone was precisely on time, and there was no people around him waving Kalashnikovs. We agreed that as far as reclaiming Palestinian rights, the Oslo Accord was a total mess, and he told me that I must go down south, and so I did a few days later. The occupation assassinated al-Musawi in 1992, and that led rise to Nasrallah. So the occupation struck Hezbollah's leadership and many thousand fighters with their wave of pager terrorism attacks and the bombing of thousands of civilians in their homes. And we should absolutely mourn their loss. But Hezbollah as an organization is still in motion. And they demonstrated that with their part of the response from Iran. They've selected new leadership who is closer to the field operations and more proficient with technology. WHO reports that IOF forces have killed at least 28 on-duty medics in the last 24 hours in Lebanon because just like Gaza, they attack doctors and first responders.
Now, I was just going to say, did you see that very strange phenomenon of Zionists making fun of the Iranian attack, being like, you didn't even kill any Israeli civilians?
Yes. They only know how to measure success in the body count. So if they don't see a pile of dead bodies, they don't understand success.
Yes. And it's also the notion that they can't fathom what targeted strikes at military infrastructure look like. It doesn't compute for them that somebody would just want to target military infrastructure.
All you did was destroy half of our base where we launch our missiles from and the F-35s. That's all you did was destroy half of that base. All you did was hit the Mossad headquarters where they gathered the intelligence to assassinate Ismail Haniyeh and Nasrallah. All you did was hit military infrastructure. And so since you didn't mass murder civilians, Zionists don't respect it.
Yeah. Very weird. And also, it speaks to the fact that they project their own worldview onto everybody else. So they're like, well, if we want to kill all the civilians, if we think there's no uninvolved civilians, if we think that, we must turn it into a tent city, Gaza, then surely that's what our enemies want to do to us. And
It felt a little bit like regret, where they're like, damn, I wish this thing was over. I wish, come get me out of here, Hezbollah. Pick me up, mommy. I'm trying to go home. Like that's the vibes I got. But it also exposes their tendency to be like, oh, they want to throw us into the sea. They want to throw us into the water. And then they literally have dumped bodies in the water and they keep returning these like truckloads full of unidentified bodies. And then there was the video where they're like, oh, they'll throw you off a roof. They'll throw you off a roof. There's a video of the IOF kicking a dead body off of a roof, So it just exposes that literally everything they accuse people of is something they are guilty of, something that they've done, something that they feel bad about, but they can't acknowledge it because they're so deeply fascist that they just decide to mock it instead, because it's like American settlers in Native America where they're like, we killed you, we took your land, and now we dress up as you for Halloween. So can't wait to see those costumes this year again.
yeah. And I mean, the Zionists were already doing that a couple of weeks into October 2023. They were taking to social media. They were dressed as Palestinians. They were mocking Palestinian suffering. Remember the clips of the social media influencers bragging about how they had electricity and water and drinking their water while they knew that Gaza was literally starving to death and they had cut the water for Gaza. So there was no water and that was entertainment for them. And then they were dressed up with their families in really racist portrayals of what Palestinians look like. And then there was that one Zionist influencer who did this whole tutorial about how to fake being injured from an Israeli airstrike with a fake baby. And super, super racist.
Hopefully they get to put on a real tutorial pretty soon. Get ready with me in my bunker. It's called the Matula special, actually.
Did you know that none of the Palestinian citizens of Israel have access to the bunkers? Like, what do they check IDs at the bunkers?
It's actually the only time that the Zionists will identify them as Palestinian, right? Every other time they're like, no, you're an Arab Israeli. But when they come to the bomb shelter, they're like, get out of here, you Palestinian.
Well, and also like they're always like, and they have equal rights. We have Arab Israelis, and they have equal rights. They enjoy freedom.
We can't help that we built their bomb shelters above ground with no walls. Like, whatever. They're equal.
They're equal.
We can't help that their bomb shelters are literally on top of our bomb shelters so that they are used as human shields. We can't help that. We can't help that.
That is a pickle.
And speaking of pickles, I've been using the No Thanks app, just to like make sure that I'm BDS compliant. And is there anything harder to buy than pickles if you want to support BDS? I feel like I'm in the pickle aisle and it is slim pickings. Okay, it is very difficult to find pickles that don't support apartheid and genocide. At this point, I'm like, damn, I gotta buy cucumbers and do this shit myself,
Something very interesting. Macron, the leader of France, has now called for an arms embargo. It's a year into the genocide, so too little, too late. But in terms of Western leaders calling for an arms embargo of Israel, it is, a little bit unprecedented. It is a big deal. And within minutes, Netanyahu has already slammed him, and it's already off, on the front page of Hot Writs. Netanyahu slams Francis Macron for calling for arms embargo on Israel's Gaza operations.
Can you believe Macron has decided to join Hamas? Isn't that wild?
Right.
Macron, new leader of Hezbollah, actually.
But what's interesting is that means that he had a moment where he realized how this was going to be recorded historically, and he realized that this is a genocide, and he was like, oops, I don't want to be associated with a genocide, right? He had that reckoning. And
More like, I've been okay being responsible for a genocide for a year, and now the consequences of my own actions are sort of creeping up and I'm getting scared. And so I want to distance myself from those consequences and those actions. And it does come a year into the genocide, so it's like, hey, welcome, took your time. But also it signifies that the United States is increasingly isolating itself from everybody. And the occupation is already isolated. People are like, with the exception of very few state actors, most people are like, these fucking Nazis are crazy. But the group of people that is supporting full-throated the occupation is getting smaller, and it's a large schism in the Western imperial machine for France to be like, we need to put the brakes on this.
100%. And I mean, you saw that in the recent General Assembly vote to enforce the ICJ advisory opinion on the illegality of the occupation of the OPT. And it was like over 120 countries voted in favor of it. Only a handful of countries voted against it or abstained. This brings us to Israel's animosity towards the UN, because the UN reflects like the global, worldview, right? It's all the countries. And I don't know if you managed to catch Netanyahu's recent speech to the UN. I only skimmed through transcript because I can't see his face. It makes me nauseous. But
I prefer the original Adolf tapes.
but he got up in front of like a half empty room that was filled also like mostly with people that he brought.
He brought guests, which is not traditional. Usually, the foreign dignitaries speak to other foreign dignitaries and representatives from all over the world. But what happened is all of those representatives walked out on him, right? And so he knew that would happen, and he brought people, which in comedy we call a bringer show.
Oh, is that a thing?
Oh yeah, it's extremely frowned upon. Like it is not respected. If you perform at bringer shows, you are a fucking hack. You take advantage of people, and like you're gonna lose friends quickly because they're gonna be upset that they're spending all this money to come see a bad comedy show.
That is so funny.
Anyways, that said, I actually have been performing for larger crowds than Benjamin Netanyahu.
As I understand it, at the General Assembly, there is a limited public gallery, and that's what was filled. The remainder of the room was partially empty because, as we saw from the videos, a number of heads of state and representatives walked out just before he spoke in protest, leaving the room half empty. But what was interesting was he got up there and he literally insulted the UN in the most unhinged, and if I was Adnan saying this, he'd probably call it iconic, right? Ways. Did you hear what he said about the UN? He called it, sorry, give me a second.
Was that an email from him? What the fuck?
No. He called it a swamp of anti-Semitic bile. Yeah, the UN, right? And then he also said that it was an anti Israel flat earth society.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes, he called the UN a swamp of anti Semitic bile and an anti Israel flat earth society.
The first one, honestly, if I was trying to like auto generate what he had said, I would have come up with something similar. I was thinking cesspool of anti-Semitism. So basically the
Right.
same thing. But I'm sorry, for the second one, did you say that he said flat earth?
Yes, an anti Israel flat earth society.
Wow. That's a really powerful thing where they attach something to something else that makes absolutely no sense, right? So
No
they're like,
sense.
you're an anti Israel flat earther. It's like, well, that's crazy because I am actually an acrobat mechanic. Did you know that? Did you know that about me?
What?
Yeah, I do both of them at the same time. Now you have people who sit as representatives at the UN who have to draft statements and be like, we believe the earth is round. First things first, we believe that the earth is circular. And now, moving on to that, what does that have to do with the occupation of Palestine?
This is coming from the same state whose ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, who, remember him as the tiny paper shredder guy. Remember that guy?
Sure.
He was on record in a video talking about how the UN building should be burned. In parallel, a couple months ago, you had them passing in the Knesset a bunch of bills saying UNRWA, UN agency tasked with providing life-saving assistance and services to many Palestinian refugees, is now going to be classified as a terrorist organization. The bills have not reached a final reading, but it's on its way. And that's unprecedented, also, right? A member state of the UN seeking to brand a UN agency as a terrorist organization. That's completely unprecedented in the history. But then at the same time, it also is very on brand, right? These are the same guys that assassinated a UN mediator at the inception of the state, right? And they got away with it. Folk Bernadotte. And I believe, if I remember from Professor MC's book, his recommendation in relation to the aftermath of the Nakba became the foundation for Resolution 194 that the Palestinian refugees should go home.
Yes, he's very influential in the history of Palestine, and they murdered him. What year was that? What year did they murder this man?
1948. And then, just like last week, they declared Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, persona non grata. They're like, you will not be allowed to come into our state.
Which is an absolute loss. They're like, hey, you do not have access to all of these pedophiles. You are not allowed around all of these literal psychos. Okay, stay away. And then he's like, okay. And how many people from the UN have they murdered the occupation? Because the numbers are rising. I think it's in the hundreds now.
They've killed hundreds of UNRWA workers in the last year of genocide in Gaza. They've also exported that same methodology to Lebanon. In Lebanon, in the airstrikes in southern Lebanon, at the end of September, I believe it was the 23rd or the 24th, they also killed UNHCR workers in a targeted airstrike on one UNHCR worker's home. She was killed along with her 4-year-old son, and her husband and her other son were pulled from the rubble with severe injuries. So now they're killing UN workers in Lebanon too. So it's just, nobody stops them. They continue doing it. They're doing it in different places. They're doing it more. They're doing it, without any concern. By the way, also, speaking of war crimes and brazenness, Al Jazeera published a new documentary about investigating war crimes, which I think is probably one of the single most important pieces of journalism that I've seen in the last year. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to watch it, but if you haven't, please do. They went through the social media accounts of thousands of Israeli occupation soldiers and compiled a list of 2,500, I believe, soldiers who posted onto their profiles evidence of crimes that they committed in Gaza, downloaded all of the information before it was scrubbed, and put it together for the purposes of this investigative piece. It's an hour something long, and they identify so many of them by name, what, battalion they're part of, where they're from, and what they've done. And there's also
These motherfuckers were updating their LinkedIn being like proficient in genocide. Like they're so dumb.
and there's like a 10-minute clip in the documentary where they interview my dear friend Mohammed El Hilo, the journalist who many of you saw me do lives with for the first 6 or 7 months of the genocide while he was still in Gaza before he was displaced to outside of Gaza because he needed surgery for his thyroid cancer. And in the clip where Muhammad is being interviewed, he he relives so many of the scenes that we heard him spoke about in my live. So please check it out, including the one infamous scene of being at Nasser Hospital where one of his colleagues was sniped by an Israeli sniper and he was bleeding out from his leg and nobody could get to him. He was right across from the hospital. And you all remember the Palestinian female doctor who took off her coat and ran across the street to go to him and managed to pull him out and drag him to safety under threat of sniper fire. It was a video that went viral and Muhammad was there recording it. And our friend Dr. Harara was also there screaming out to Muhammad's colleague who was injured, giving him advice for how to wrap his legs so that he didn't bleed out. And it was something that we saw him live at the time and now is memorialized in this documentary. So please check it out. This is a very important documentary and as many people as possible should see it. And we'll try to link to it in the YouTube for sure. So
I didn't watch the whole documentary, but I did watch them upload clips daily. So I'm pretty up to speed. I saw the documentary piece by piece.
Well, actually, it's not a joke because everything that they included in the documentary, I was like, I remember seeing this. I remember seeing that. I remember seeing that. I remember seeing that. All of the images and the videos are already seared into my brain. So I had that same feeling.
And then Middle East Monitor came out with an article, 902 Palestinian families wiped out in Gaza by Israel over the past year, according to the media office. And for the New York Times, that's how you write a headline, by the way. I just wanted to take a second and sit with 902 families wiped off the registry.
It's not even like individual nuclear families, it's actual family names. So like the family name does not exist anymore. So the entire family is gone. And I kept thinking to myself how important and necessary it is to memorialize all of their names, because we need to have a record of their names. We need to know that they're a part of our Palestinian identity, our history, and they're unfortunately not going to be a part of our Palestinian future because of this genocide. But we can't forget them. We can't forget who they are. And there has to be an effort made to identify and disseminate so that we can always remember who they are.
The Israeli army exterminated 1,364 Palestinian families by killing all of their members, leaving only one individual per family, and similarly wiped out 3,472 Palestinian families, leaving just 2 individuals per family.
The feeling I had was, if you know Palestinians, you know how family is everything. We're not an individualistic society. People don't make decisions based on what's best for them as individuals. It's always what's good for our family. We're very family oriented. We live with our families. We often live with our extended families. And if you think about what it means for a Palestinian to be the only person left from their entire family, I cannot think of anything more lonely. And it's very distressing to hear. And to hear that there are so many people living that trauma is extremely distressing. It was just, where do you go from here? Family is everything. How do you rebuild a life from that? What is there to rebuild? You're alone. It's very, very, very difficult to process that information.
Yeah. If you're somebody who's like still unlearning Zionism, or you're like questioning the Palestinian narrative or whatever, I don't really care where you are on your journey, but I do want to do a little thought exercise. Let's say that the people who are responsible for kicking you out of your home, for stealing your land, for making your life miserable, weren't just satisfied with that. What if they also killed your whole family? What would you do? What would you dedicate your life to? How would you spend the rest of your conscious days on this earth? And that's what I was talking about earlier, where it's like the occupation doesn't realize that by all of these political assassinations, by all of these displacements, by continuing a Nakba in Lebanon and continuing the genocide in Gaza, they are creating generations of people who are motivated, who will seek retribution, and who have literally nothing to lose because you've taken everything from them. It's the Batman origin story. Y'all just created the next generation of people who will liberate Palestine and Lebanon from the hands of Zionist settler terrorism.
It's just like, do you want a brown fascist or a white fascist? Like, I want no fascists. Like,
yeah, red fascist,
now,
blue fascist. It feels like the worst Dr. Seuss ever.
Yeah. Speaking of Dr. Seuss, have you seen that Zionist children's book about like settling in Lebanon?
Yes.
Child abuse. You know who made it too? It's like the settler group that Daniela Weiss is part of.
Of course.
They're like publishing fascist children's books about taking over Lebanon. And I'm like, it's so interesting because in the book, it's called Lebanon.
Yeah.
And it's like,
what are they
it's
gonna call
literally, well, if you think it's yours, don't you have a different name for it?
Well, yeah. Isn't it crazy that
They're
they
like,
tried to
no.
steal the Jordan Valley? Like,
Right.
it's got Jordan in the name, bro.
It's deeply disturbing. But like, we know, we've covered it. We know that the brainwashing starts very young.
You know what's crazy
surprised.
is they wrote that book for the people in Knesset.
There you go.
It's not even for the children.
It's for it's for
the
adults.
Yeah. Because that is their reading level, is they prefer
Yes.
pictures. They crush a Denny's menu, but like a real book
Oh.
is tough. Floyd Mayweather, honorary member of Knesset. Did you know that? That's crazy.
Because he can't read.
He teaches them how to read, actually. Folks, That's been another episode of the pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Check out our full episodes and sources at www.palestinepod.com. Follow us on Instagram at the Palestine Pod. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com and look for us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That has been another episode of the pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have as good a day as you can.
We can start telling people to join the Patreon. The show wouldn't be possible without a Patreon. You got to get on our Patreon. Support us on Patreon. You can, because like I've been watching all these other podcasts and they just keep plugging Patreon like all the time.
Yeah, I'm going to clip what you just did right now.
Okay.